The big difference between North Africa and the Soviet Union is that for the German Reich, North Africa was a secondary theater. No ideological objectives were involved, as was the case in the Soviet Union, where the aim was to destroy communist ideology and wipe out large sections of the population.
The myth of the war in Africa is linked so closely to Erwin Rommel because basically Rommel represents what the German public wanted. A swashbuckling general who seemed to be a man of the people, a military leader who was loved by his troops and who successfully commanded large armored formations from the very front.
He was a kind of pop star of National Socialism. In Erwin Rommel, Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels also had a willing colleague.
It was the kind of war you imagine in an adventure novel or an adventure film. Naturally, the appropriate pictures also inspired the nation. So in this respect, as a theater of war, North Africa was tailor-made for propaganda purposes.
To the British, it was a major theater of war. For them, it was all about defending the British Empire.
Rommel and Montgomery were professional soldiers. Montgomery was the analytical type, while Rommel took a more aggressive approach to warfare.
Casablanca made it quite clear that for Allied leaders, the only acceptable end to the war would be Germany's unconditional surrender. This was a crystal clear signal to Berlin.
Relentless pursuit in the Libyan desert. British troops in search of the remnants of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's defeated army. The victor of El Alamein, Bernard L. Montgomery, was firmly resolved to eliminate the German and Italian forces once and for all and bring the whole of North Africa under Allied control.
For the British in particular, El Alamein has remained a highly important battle even through to the present day, and for two reasons. It was the last major battle of the Second World War which the British fought on their own. Later, basically, they only fought together with the Americans, and in the further course of the war, American influence grew. Secondly, for the British, El Alamein also marked a turning point. Churchill once remarked that we experienced no victories before El Alamein nor any defeats afterwards.
British Prime Minister Churchill and American President Roosevelt both realized that a landing by Allied units on the European continent was too risky. But they agreed that Morocco and Algeria, which belonged to French North Africa, were more suitable for an invasion. So Churchill and Roosevelt went ahead and complied with Stalin's demand for a military offensive. Operation Torch was launched on November 8, 1942.
American paratroops and airborne infantry, flown from Britain 1,500 miles away, had landed to capture airfields, while other American troops had poured ashore on the beaches, protected by the British Navy. Here, as in Algiers, the fighting lasted for only a few hours. But at Casablanca, the battle still raged.
Massive bombardment of French coastal positions was designed to make any defensive measures difficult. Then the landing craft set off.
At this point, Operation Torch was the biggest amphibious landing in history. So to begin with, it was a logistical feat, and it met with military success. Secondly, the American troops were in fact attacking a neutral country, Vichy France, to which Algeria belonged. The American landing was, of course, a fundamentally risky enterprise. On the one hand, because the troops lacked combat experience, and on the other, because they had no real idea of what to expect or what they would be capable of achieving.
Morocco and Algeria were under the control of the Nazi-friendly regime in Vichy in France. But the Germans had a lot of influence there. So the British and the Americans were not sure whether to expect resistance from the 60,000 troops in the French colonial army.
The French fought against the landing forces, losing just over 1,000 men. But they changed sides relatively quickly, and this allowed the American forces to advance fairly quickly. Thirdly, Torch was, of course, a second front in the rear of the German and Italian tank army, which up to then had only ever had to attack in one direction. But now it had to face in two directions and fight against two different enemies.
In Algeria, the Americans captured Italian liaison officers. French resistance fighters had arrested most of the Vichy military leaders in a lightning attack and thus enabled the Algerian capital to be conquered quickly. In view of the delight shown by its inhabitants, the colonial masters abandoned their hesitant attitude.
French Commander-in-Chief Admiral Darlan gave the order to join forces with the Allies. Now, at last, Hitler understood the importance of North Africa as a theater of war. He had long refused to send troops to North Africa because the war in the East against the Soviet Union was far more important to him. But now, units were quickly dispatched to North Africa. Large Air Force squadrons were sent to the Mediterranean, and at a time when on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad was being encircled. So German Air Force units that were urgently needed in Stalingrad were now tied up in the Mediterranean.
The main aim of Operation Torch was to take French Tunisia before the Axis powers could move troops there. But the advance lacked planning and was disorganized. As a result, within a short space of time, the Wehrmacht was able to get 25,000 men in position. On November 25, 1942, a tank battle took place which ended with the Germans having to retreat. Field Marshal Rommel found himself in a dangerous predicament.
After the defeat at El Alamein, and especially after Operation Torch, which came a few weeks later, the Germans and Italian forces were naturally in dire straits. On the one hand, they had suffered an emphatic defeat at El Alamein and only avoided total destruction because Rommel had ignored orders to hold his ground and, together with his staff, had managed to withdraw his troops in some form of order. So basically the situation was hopeless.
After retaking Tobruk, the British 8th Army advanced west, capturing one port after another. The aim was to drive Rommel's Afrika Korps out of Libya once and for all. A British propaganda film presented the advance as a heroic tale of success.
In Cyrene, the 8th Army passed from desert to a green countryside, which its Italian colonists had abandoned, and it was no more than a week between our taking Tobruk and entering Benghazi. At Benghazi we paused to replenish our supplies. The harbor, bombed by us for over 2 years, so regularly that the pilots called it doing the mail run, was now littered with sunken ships. Cranes, installations, and most of the quays were demolished. Yet the Navy and engineers worked to such good purpose that before long our ships were unloading. By sea and land, we were soon bringing up 3 million gallons of petrol a week and 8,000 tons of ammunition.
Meanwhile, units of the 1st U.S. Tank Division were advancing further and further into Tunisia from the west. They were accompanied by an American camera team which even filmed in color. When German aircraft attacked, the cameramen took some spectacular pictures. On December 1st, 1942, German tanks mounted a counterattack at Terbuba.
This is the actual battlefield. Germans on the left, Americans on the right.
The Americans, who were supported by British units, were shocked by the Germans' firepower.
A British ammunition lorry is hit.
The British artillery also had little impact on the Wehrmacht's tanks. What's more, the German Air Force mounted repeated attacks. What the Allies didn't know was that Hitler had ordered brand new German tanks to be sent not to the Eastern Front, but to Tunisia. And they proved to be seemingly invulnerable. They couldn't even be successfully combated from a short distance of 100 meters.
These are German Mark IV tanks. The straw-covered barns in the foreground conceal Nazi 88mm anti-tank guns.
After suffering heavy losses, the American tanks finally had to retreat. Naturally, the US color film failed to mention this.
These scenes were photographed from a hill overlooking the battlefield. The cameraman is actually nearer the German lines than his own.
The Moroccan port city of Casablanca had already capitulated 2 days after the Americans landed. In mid-January 1943, a hotel and several comfortably appointed villas in the upmarket suburb of Anfa had been cleared to accommodate delegations from Washington and London.
Casablanca was also an extremely important step in the Allied conduct of the war, because Roosevelt and Churchill met there and held talks at the highest political level. This was not only politically necessary and essential to the joint conduct of the war, it was also a signal to the world that the United States was now ready to enter the war against the German aggressors and finally open the Second Front, which Stalin had always so vehemently demanded.
Exhausted from the 5-day voyage, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt had also arrived in Casablanca with his delegation. Joseph Stalin had cancelled his participation because of the battle at Stalingrad.
Hier muss man den gemeinsamen Kurs so abstecken, dass es beim Verhandeln...
The joint course had to be laid down in such a way that in negotiations with the Soviets, there would be nothing that Stalin could construe as hidden disagreement between the two Western powers.
Daran lag vor allen Dingen Churchill, und Churchill lag noch mehr daran.
This was important to Churchill, and what was even more important to Churchill was for the Americans to understand Britain's position.
Positionen begreifen. Was bei den Amerikanern nicht unbedingt gegeben war, denn
that was not automatically the case, because the US was not interested in its intervention, perpetuating British colonial rule in the region.
Briten und Amerikaner waren schon eng beieinander.
The British and the Americans were very close, but not that close.
Es passte kein Blatt Papier zwischen die beiden.
For over 20 years, the US president had suffered from a serious disease that confined him to a wheelchair. He avoided pictures that showed his handicap. Consequently, he reviewed the American forces' Guard of Honor while sitting in a jeep.
Whereas Washington would have preferred to land right on the coast of the German Reich in order to drive the enemy back to Berlin at a rate of knots, the British took a rather more moderate view of the situation. They favored a war of attrition, a thrust into the soft belly of the German military, first into Italy, then through the Balkans. These were two different approaches. And in the end, the British got their way, because their plan required fewer resources and was less risky.
In Casablanca werden zwei Sachen festgelegt.
In Casablanca, two decisions were taken. Firstly, a strategic decision that the war in North Africa should be brought to a close, followed by a campaign in Italy. In other words, in a continuation of the Mediterranean strategy, there was, for the time being at least, to be no landing in Western Europe. Secondly, on a political level, it was decided that Germany would have to accept unconditional surrender. This would be an important sign to the world that in this war, the Allies were no longer prepared to give the criminal Nazi regime any opportunity to issue conditions.
The conference took place under strict secrecy. German propaganda had got wind of the meeting between the two statesmen. Joseph Goebbels suspected that Churchill had traveled to Washington. The Nazi press awaited the closing communiqué with demonstrative composure.
Die NS-Propaganda allerdings
Nazi propaganda, however, skillfully turned the demand for unconditional surrender into a claim that the British and the Americans merely wanted to destroy the German Reich and the German nation. Consequently, unconditional surrender must be seen ultimately as a double-edged sword, because it even strengthened German perseverance under Nazi propaganda.
At roughly the same time, Hitler received Romanian leader Ion Antonescu at his Wolf's Lair headquarters. The Führer was still unwilling to accept that the Sixth Army no longer stood any chance at Stalingrad. Nor did Hitler see the war in North Africa as lost either. Even though US forces were adapting better and better to Erwin Rommel's tactical ploys and inflicting heavy losses on the Afrika Korps. The Field Marshal was now under no illusion that this war could still be won.
Rommel gradually withdrew to the Tunisian-Libyan border, finally arriving there in January 1943. He once again found prepared defensive positions, but he also warned that his army could be destroyed at any time. Rommel argued the case for all Axis forces to be withdrawn from the African theater of war. But Kesselring, who was his superior, said, no, everything is fine. We'll manage it with reinforcements. We'll certainly be able to stop the British and the Americans. For Hitler, of course, it was clear. Who was he going to believe? Rommel, the pessimist, or Kesselring, the optimist? For Hitler, the choice was easy. He trusted Kesselring and sent further reinforcements to Africa.
But now the enemy attack rose to a crescendo.
Axis units put up desperate resistance to the superior force of 500,000 Allied troops. The British and Americans now had their sights set on Tripoli, the Libyan capital.
Despite great efforts, German supplies did not arrive in the required quantities. The biggest transport aircraft in World War II, the Me-323, brought supplies to North Africa several times, but it merely delayed a defeat which was now inevitable for the Germans.
The Gigant, or Giant, was the biggest land-based transport aircraft of the Second World War. It could carry 100 men and their equipment and up to 13 tons of freight or one tank. However, it was also an easy target for Allied attacks.
While we'd been building up our strength, Rommel had been digging in at El Agheila. But after remaining 3 weeks preparing to fight, he changed his mind and withdrew as soon as he felt the full weight of our attack. His indecision achieved nothing except to intensify our new onslaught. From El Agheila to Tripoli is 530 miles. It took the Eighth Army 41 days to accomplish it. During that time, they fought several actions with Rommel's rearguards, putting down on one occasion a barrage rivaling that of El Alamein. But though we were delayed, our onward sweep was never in doubt. Just before the last stage began, General Montgomery said in an order of the day, "Nothing has stopped us since the Battle of Egypt began. Nothing will stop us now." And nothing did. 8 days later, we were fighting on the outskirts of Tripoli itself.
Montgomery really had not pursued Rommel's retreating army fast enough. The Eighth Army's commander-in-chief was unwilling to risk heavy losses. According to a high-ranking British officer, the hounding should be left to other armies. In the end, though, Montgomery decided to beat the Americans to the punch with regard to Tripoli. He attacked first, and on January 23, 1943, the British occupied the Libyan capital.
The surrender of Tripoli by the governor of Libya and the mayor of the city extinguished the Italian overseas empire. Country by country, the British army had conquered it. Abyssinia, Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, Libya, Tripolitania. Not a single town now remained to them.
Led by the legendary 11th Hussars, the 8th Army entered Tripoli. But Rommel was once again a step ahead of Montgomery and had already withdrawn his troops. Naturally, the propaganda film Desert Victory makes no mention of this. It enthusiastically celebrates the British success and even includes a personal message from Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
In 80 days, the 8th Army had advanced close on 1,400 miles, a feat unparalleled in military history. Throughout the battle and advance, for every casualty suffered, it had inflicted 5 on the enemy. In the words of Mr. Churchill,
"You have altered the face of the war in a most remarkable way. What it has meant in the skill and organization of movement and maneuver, what it has meant in the tireless endurance and self-denial of the troops, and in the fearless leadership displayed in action, can be appreciated only by those who are actually on the spot. But I must tell you that the fame of the Desert Army has spread throughout the world."
On February 7, 1943, Churchill visited the 8th Army and, together with General Montgomery, took the salute at a parade of the British troops. The Prime Minister was dreaming of a resurrection of the British Empire, which would be bigger and more powerful than ever before. Italy, at any rate, had been eliminated once and for all as a colonial power. Now, only the Germans were a problem in North Africa. The loss of Tripoli was a serious blow for Erwin Rommel because some of his front-line supplies came in through the port. The Field Marshal himself still had around 10,000 combat-ready troops and about 100 tanks. His intention was to join forces with General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Tank Army on the Mareth line in southern Tunisia.
Looked
at on its own and within the context of the North African campaign, the establishment of the Mareth position was, of course, an outstanding feat of military leadership. Especially after the defeat and the absolute disaster that had occurred at El Alamein, it was also a great achievement by the soldiers who had to make the concept a reality and actually build a sustainable defensive position. But if I analyze it on a strategic level, the question arises, as indeed with the entire campaign, as to what the actual purpose of the operation was.
Battle lines were drawn. In the north stood the British First Army. In the center, General Giraud's French troops. In the south, the Americans. Further south, a small group of fighting French had completed its historic 1,500-mile march and taken up positions on the left flank of the British 8th Army, which faced the formidable Mareth line.
It was perfectly clear that this defensive position too could be no more than an intermediate step, and it was totally unclear what would happen next. If the troops were to be evacuated, the defensive position would be highly important for taking any evacuation measures. Ultimately, it was the last holding line for introducing any reinforcements in order to attack. Basically, history itself answered the question. Without the Mareth line, the evacuation of at least some of the units, including above all Field Marshal Rommel himself, would in all likelihood not have been possible.
In the meantime, the Americans had stationed the 9th Air Force's 12th Bombardment Group on the airfield at Medellin in Tunisia. From there, the Earthquakers, as they were known, attacked German positions, in particular the airfield near Sfax, directly on Tunisia's Mediterranean coast, which was occupied by the German Air Force. Missions were dangerous because German anti-aircraft cannon were still able to damage or even bring down the US bombers. An American camera team took spectacular color pictures of damaged aircraft coming in to land. crew of this bomber wasn't so lucky. The pilot didn't survive the emergency landing. US Commander-in-Chief Dwight D. Eisenhower was concerned at the slow advance of his troops. He placed his hopes in generals like George S. Patton, who were ready to take risks. On February 19, 1943, a decisive battle took place.
Die Deutschen glauben, dass sie gegen die relativ kampfunerfahrenen
The Germans thought they could defeat the relatively inexperienced American troops, so they tried to break through at the Kasserine Pass, which lies roughly in central Tunisia, and then turn north in order to encircle all Allied troops stationed in northern Tunisia. At first, the battle at Kasserine Pass went very well for the Germans. After a few days, however, the Americans and their commander, General Patton, who played an important role, managed to get sufficient supplies and reserves through to the pass and stop the German advance.
Sodass der deutsche Vormarsch zum Stehen kommt.
Basically, the Kasserine offensive was not only Rommel's last offensive, one he himself conducted, it was also the last offensive at all in North Africa by German and Italian units. Thus, the war in North Africa was decided. This is also indicated by the fact that Rommel was withdrawn to the safety of Italy. At least he was. The German units stayed put.
The Desert Fox had failed once and for all. But the news was not allowed to be made public on the home front, where Rommel was still a useful idol.
As defeat loomed ever larger, early in March 1943, Rommel was recalled from North Africa for very special propaganda or political reasons. The Nazis did not want to see Rommel associated with the defeat. Goebbels wrote in his diary that Rommel will still be of great importance to us, so we can't allow him to be burnt out, so to speak, in North Africa. It would also be a bad sign to the people at home, indeed to the world public, if Germany's most popular and famous general were to be taken prisoner. So the Nazi leadership had other things planned for Erwin Rommel, without recognizing, however, that in the meantime, the field marshal had become fairly disillusioned about the further course of the war and Germany's chance of winning it.
In November 1943, Rommel was given the task of securing the Atlantic Wall in France. After the Allies had landed successfully in Normandy, he was seriously injured in an attack by a fighter aircraft. Because of his links to the 20th of July plotters, the field marshal was ordered by Hitler to commit suicide.
Rommel bleibt ein Faszinosum, weil verschiedene
Rommel remained a fascinating figure because in his military career he showed various ways of acting on a human level.
Da steht dann Rommel auch wieder, repräsentativ.
Rommel is representative of Germany. It wasn't Germany that betrayed Hitler. Hitler betrayed Germany with all the consequences of a war that was lost not just militarily and politically, but morally as well.
Oder politisch, sondern auch moralisch verloren wurde.
On March 9th, 1943, Hitler appointed Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim to succeed Rommel as Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Africa. Arnim had already proved himself a loyal follower of the dictator on the Eastern Front. As an experienced tank commander, he placed his faith in the combat capabilities of the armor sent to North Africa.
General von Arnim was regarded as a safe hand in a crisis, so he was deliberately sent to North Africa because he had stood firm in the past and was the type of general Hitler particularly liked. Commanders who were dogged, leaders who didn't operate wildly hither and thither, and in a way act flexibly, but who simply held out with strength of character. And that was Arnim, just the type of general Hitler wanted.
Von Arnim was generally seen as an extremely solid officer who led his men in the same sound way. But he was also regarded as being at least loyal to the regime. It is said that the war in North Africa was fair in how it was fought, but von Arnim had little time for that. On the contrary, when he arrived in North Africa, he told his troops he wanted them to hate their British enemy.
When Rommel was recalled and Arnim took command of all German forces in North Africa, he immediately declared that all talk of fair play, which has existed up to now with regard to the British, is total nonsense. The British want to destroy the German Reich, so all talk of fair play must stop.
In late March 1943, the remnants of the Afrika Korps were systematically bombarded by the 8th Army and pushed back further and further towards Tunis. It would be only a matter of time before they were totally surrounded by Allied forces. In view of this overwhelming force, the German positions became harder and harder to defend.
The Germans, pinned down by the Northumbrians at Mareth, moved their armour too late. The New Zealanders, thenceforth to be known as the left hookers, drove through.
The cheering crowds contained numerous Jews who, under the German occupation, had had to fear for their lives.
Jewish boys taking off the yellow stars they'd been made to wear as if they was lepers.
The Jewish inhabitants of Tunisia had been made to do forced labor by General von Arnim and prepare defenses against Allied attacks. Before then, the Germans had ruthlessly plundered Jewish communities. Now, all the local slave workers could return to their hometowns and villages. But they still remained second-class citizens. The British, in particular, treated them with the arrogance of colonial masters. US Commander-in-Chief Dwight D. Eisenhower had learned from his mistakes and was now acting with growing self-confidence.
Of the various strategies which might now be employed against the enemy, General Eisenhower chose one which envisaged the entire military situation in terms of a cylinder. The Western Wall, Allied land forces along the Great Dorsal. The Northern and Eastern, Allied air and sea power concentrated in the Mediterranean. The seaports of Tunis and Bizerte were to act as the intake valve, through which those enemy troops that escaped the devastating attacks of planes and submarines based at Malta were to be sucked into the cylinder. At the bottom of the cylinder stood the powerful British 8th Army to serve as the piston, which in its upward stroke would push the enemy into an ever smaller space. Still in possession of the enemy were certain high hills to the west of Tunis and Bizerte. Their capture was an essential part of the entire strategy, for these hills were the spark plug, which, when the piston had forced the enemy into a state of high compression, would explode the combustible mass.
Hitler had strictly forbidden the evacuation of the Afrika Korps, so the Germans and Italians had no choice but to fight to the bitter end or to surrender.
After the failure of the last German offensive at Kasserine Pass, it was merely a question of time before the bridgehead in Tunis collapsed. The Allies were forcing the Germans and Italians further and further back towards Tunis. What's more, the supply situation for the German and Italian troops was getting steadily worse. Consequently, on May 13, 1943, the remnants of the German and Italian troops in Army Group Africa surrendered. After Stalingrad, this was a second major defeat for the Germans.
The end came quickly. By tens, by hundreds, by thousands they came. On foot, in trucks.
Ultimately, these men owed their lives to the arbitrary act by Erwin Rommel, who, after the defeat at El Alamein, ignored Hitler's orders and began a retreat.
At the end, 15 full divisions, 266,000 of their best men laid down their arms. No Bataan this, no Crete, No men riddled with disease and shrunken with hunger, fighting to the last barehanded. Educated in the school for power, they were quick to recognize superior power. And when they did, they quit cold. This is the end of the Axis African adventure.
Ultimately, the capitulation of the German troops in Tunis was a result of the deteriorating situation after the Axis forces had been defeated at El Alamein. American units had landed successfully in Algeria as part of Operation Torch, and German and Italian forces had proved unable to stop the two attacking forces, partly because their supply chain had finally collapsed. People at home were already talking about Tunisgrad, a reference to the defeat at Stalingrad a few months earlier. This was a disastrous time for German and Italian military leaders. Anything other than surrender was out of the question, because otherwise the Axis troops in North Africa would simply have starved to death.
The world-conquering dreams of an army were over. Some prisoners look apathetic. Some appear relieved, while others seem to make no attempt to hide their hatred. In the end, over 260,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. Half of them belonged to Rommel's Afrika Korps. Most of the Germans were taken by ship to America to spend the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. Thanks to massive American help, the British had emerged victorious.
Nordafrika dient auch den Briten und den Amerikanern als Test.
North Africa also served the British and the Americans as a testing ground for further operations. The British in particular reverted to their strengths, artillery and the Air Force, firepower and keeping their own losses to a minimum. The British approach was certainly very schematic, highly predictable, very slow, but also very assured. It always ended in victory. That might not always have seemed spectacular, perhaps, but ultimately the British knew where their strength lay. On the British side, a lot of things needed improving, especially with regard to cooperation between ground troops and the Air Force. But these were all learning processes in the course of the war. The Americans also learned quickly. In his memoirs, Rommel clearly stressed how swiftly the Americans had learned and that a lot still had to be expected from them. Yet most of Germany's leaders failed to draw the right conclusions from the failures in North Africa. Blame was attached to the incapable Italians and to Allied material.
Man schiebt's auf die unfähigen Italiener und man schiebt's aufs alliierte Material.
A German military cemetery in Tunisia. Around 20,000 of Hitler's elite soldiers paid for the North African adventure with their lives. In Tunis on May 20th, 1943, the Allies celebrated their victory with a 2-hour military parade. Later, Winston Churchill wrote in his memoirs, "No one could doubt the importance of the victory achieved in Tunisia. Africa has been purged of an enemy. A continent has been liberated."
The North African theater showed quite clearly that this was also a testing ground for the Allies. Who had passed and who hadn't. People like Auchinleck and so on played no further role in the rest of the war. Others, like Montgomery, Patton, and Eisenhower, were figures who, in the eyes of their country's leaders, had shown their quality. The Allies then trusted them through to the end of the war. They were, in fact, the dominant personalities in the last 2 years of the war that ended in the defeat of Nazi Germany.
U.S. Commander-in-Chief Dwight D. Eisenhower had no cause to give his troops a rest after their victory in North Africa. Luck was on his side, and he had long since ordered Nazi Germany to be weakened further as quickly as possible, at first mainly from the air. Stationed at Berka airfield in Libya was a squadron of B-24 bombers, which carried out strategic attacks on targets in Italy, southern Germany, and Austria. Whereas Britain's Royal Air Force specialized in the carpet bombing of German cities, the Americans focused mainly on Germany's infrastructure and industrial facilities. On this operation, the flying fortresses of the 376th Bombardment Group attacked aircraft factories in Regensburg and Wiener Neustadt. In the meantime, the Allies were preparing their next offensive.
As a result of the Italians and the Germans having had to capitulate in North Africa and the Axis thus losing the war in North Africa, the British southern flank, their empire, so to speak, was safe, and they could use their resources elsewhere. So North Africa was an important step towards the landings later, not only in Italy, but in Normandy too. So it was also an important step for the Allies in their victory over Nazi Germany.
At the conference in Casablanca, the Allies agreed to defer landing on the French Channel coast. First, Sicily was to be taken to make communication routes through the Mediterranean more secure. The effective date for Operation Husky was July 10th, 1943. The 1st US Infantry Division was allocated a section in the Gulf of Jala. Because of their division badge, the elite troops were admiringly known as the Big Red One. Cameramen from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, were in the front line to document the landing. The Italians had long since become war-weary and wanted nothing more than to get out of their disastrous coalition with Hitler. 2 weeks after the start of the Allied offensive, Benito Mussolini was removed from power by the fascist Grand Council in Rome. Just as in North Africa, the Germans put up fierce resistance. The fighting lasted 38 days. When it ended, Sicily was under Allied control.
When you look at the war in North Africa from a German perspective, there seems to have been little point in it. Looking at the map, though, it might seem to have a purpose if you consider a strategic variation. That German and Italian forces would advance over the Suez Canal and, instead of heading for East Africa, would make for the Persian corridor. They could then meet up at the oil fields in the Caucasus, with German armies attacking eastwards in the Soviet Union. This pincer movement would have been conceivable, but it would have meant a totally different approach by the German Wehrmacht. But if you think this scenario right through, it is scary how the Second World War might have ended, had this option been chosen.
This plan was never seriously pursued, but Rommel's dream of leading an Africa Corps parade in Cairo one day was finally over. Instead, it was Americans who visited the ancient sites of the pharaohs. Hollywood director George Stevens had come from the United States with his own camera teams to document the Allies' victory over Hitler. But first, sightseeing was on the agenda, an ambassador of freedom in front of the symbols of civilization. Stevens would also be present in 1945, when those responsible for terror, war, and genocide perish ignominiously